Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to today's lecture. You're probably all aware that Lyn Hejinian will be talking in the capacity of the Pearl Andelson Sherry Memorial Poet. Before I give a brief prefatory remark and some history about the memorial poet position, I just want to remind you all that Lyn will be reading tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock at the International House, right? In the homeroom of International House tomorrow, which is just down this street, maybe 2 or 3 blocks to the east. And at that time, Srikanth Reddy will be providing a considerably more thorough introduction to Lyn's work. Right now, I'm just going to talk briefly about the history of this Sherry program and then introduce Lyn briefly, who will then speak to you about more interesting things. So a brief account of the history of the Pearl Anderson Sherry Memorial Poetry Reading and Lecture Series is that it was founded to honor the life and work of former University of Chicago student Pearl Andelson Sherry. Pearl Anderson Sherry was born on the west side of Chicago in 1899. Despite objections from her father, she attended the university for 1 year, probably in 1916 or 17. During that time, Pearl Sherry met a group of writers and poets involved in the Poetry Club, including Ivor Winters, Janet Lewis, and John Toigo. She remained friends with the members of the Poetry Club for the rest of her life. This literary circle nurtured Pearl Sherry's own aspirations as a writer, and she began her writing career working at Poetry Magazine here in Chicago with Harriet Monroe. Her first book of poetry, Fringe, was published in 1923, and her poetry, fiction, and reviews appeared in many periodicals, including Dial, Poetry, New Republic, Chelsea, and the Southern Review. Pearl Sherry continued to write and publish poetry until shortly before she died in 1996. Established in 1997 through a gift from the Sherry family, the Pearl Andelson Sherry Memorial Fund annually brings a major contemporary poet to the University of Chicago, the United States of the University of Chicago, to work with students and to present the Pearl Andelson Sherry Memorial Poetry Reading and Lecture. Past Sherry poets, as we will henceforward refer to them, have been, in the last few years, Mark Strand, Carl Phillips, Susan Howe, Michael Palmer, Mark Doty, and Alan Grossman, among others. And as you probably all know, tonight's Sherry poet is Lyn Hejinian, a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets and author of literally dozens of collections of poetry, critical prose, translations, and collaborations. Lyn is one of the most important and exciting living American poets, and we're extremely lucky to have her here, always attentive to the fabric of language, from the level of the sentence to larger questions of structure and genre. Lyn's work over the past 30 years has challenged and expanded our notions of what poetry is and can be. Today, she will be talking to us about another major American poet, Gertrude Stein, whose work with genre and language significantly helped to set the stage for Lyn's own work. We're extremely lucky to have Lyn here with us for this week, and I invite you all to please join me in welcoming Lyn Hejinian.
Thank you. I'm delighted that I will be reading tomorrow night, or tomorrow evening, in something called International House. I am going to talk, my talk this afternoon is grounded in a particular work of Gertrude Stein's that I don't expect anybody to have read, Lucy Church Amiably. And it discusses a problem that Stein encountered, which I'll elaborate more articulately in a moment, for the first time in the mid-1920s, and then significantly after her first trip to the United States, where she gave, in 1934, where she gave a series of lectures. And interestingly, she was invited to read in Berkeley at the University of California. And then when the time came, the then chair of the English department, whose name I can't remember, but who was chair for 35 years, decided that Gertrude Stein was not significant enough to read on the premises of the University of California. And her lecture was moved to International House. So I think it's this can only be good for me, if not for Stein. The title of this is Lateness, the Latitudes of Lucy Church Amiably. And I'm just going to read it through, I hope, and then there's going to be some time for questions and answers after I'm told. I'm not sure I can answer the questions, but I'll certainly be delighted to hear them. Russian formalist theory of the early 20th century made an important and now familiar distinction between plot and story. The story of anything is its strictly chronological unfolding, what happened in precisely the order in which it happened. The plot is the order in which those happenings are arranged artistically, the order in which they are offered for experience, liberated from their chronology, retimed, and given over to a different logic or logics. But there's more to plot than that. The story is sequential. Therefore, in apposition, the plot should be consequential. And it is, but not within the same parameters as those of the story. The story transits and retransits the plot, crisscrosses it, often paying it little attention as it pursues its own set of possible consequences or transgresses against them, as was the case, for example, in the writings of the Marquis de Sade. The plot includes not just the arrangement of the story elements, but also all of the artistic devices that are brought into play, digressions, puns, and inconsequential bird's flight across an otherwise undisturbed sky. Gertrude Stein describes such birds in the sky of the landscape in Lyn, which is the inspiration for Lucy Church Amiably. Magpies are in the landscape, that is, they are in the sky of a landscape. They are black and white, and they are in the sky of the landscape in Lyn. When they are in the sky, they do something that I have never seen any other bird do. They hold themselves up and down and look flat against the sky. They look exactly like the birds in the Annunciation pictures, the bird which is the Holy Ghost. End quote. With its structural and lexical motifs and their particular syntactic organization, and in the little passage I just quoted, a small allegorical element, the plot lays out the landscape of the work. It is in the casting of its plot that a work of art generates recurrence and establishes patterns, analogous perhaps to the microsystems current in a landscape, whether urban or rural, domestic or social. The plot draws things out into the serious, imaginative game of art. The notion of an artistic plot, with an explicit analogy to a plot of ground and hence to a landscape, puts the concept into a spatial frame. This belies one of this talk's principal concerns, which is with temporal quality in high modernism and late modernity. It is also concerned with temporal quantity, but that is in most ways itself a qualitative problem, suffusing whatever sense one might have of a good life. But framing matters in terms of landscape is inevitable in what follows, since in the context of its temporal concerns, what I intend to talk about is based on a textual landscape, drawn from an actual one in which the author was living. The text from which I've drawn the ideas I'll attempt to lay out is Gertrude Stein's Lucy Church Amiably, a work that Stein described in the advertisement at the front of the book as a return to romantic nature, that is, it makes a landscape, and a novel of romantic beauty and nature. The landscape from which it draws is that of a region of France through which the Rhone flows just to the west of the French Alps. Lucy Church Amiably is a modernist text written in 1927 and first published in 1930 as the initial offering of plain editions, the press that Alice B. Toklas and Gertrude Stein created for the sake of publishing Stein's work. Thanks to Dalkey Archive Press, Lucy Church Amiably is currently in print, but it is one of the less frequently read works of Gertrude Stein, whose works are not frequently read in any case. I don't expect anyone in the audience to be familiar with the book. In talking about this work as a landscape of some temporal turmoil, I want to lay out a nexus of interests, one of which is an interest in the nexus per se, nexicity, if you will, as a reality principle that structures what I will call, after Theodor Adorno and Edward Said, but with my own twists on it, late work, as well as the conditions on which lateness reflects everyday life. The artistic imagination has gravitational pull. It attracts the world around it. The distinction between foreground and background evaporates. As a relative concept, background loses reality, and it disappears as an organizing principle of context. Everything enters the foreground. Everything is pulled near. The imagination increases its magnetic charge by doodling or muttering, scribbling or humming, while things flicker in increasing proximity. The strength of the temporal charge of these things, in return, is a measure of their vitality. For Gertrude Stein in 1927, spending the summer in the French countryside near the Rhone, the asparagus in the garden, the cascading of a nearby waterfall, the church in the town of Lucy, some 6 miles to the east, and the rising bulk of Mont Blanc, 55 miles beyond, all came to the imagination with equal force. In her writings of the period, her landscape period, from approximately 1925 to 1934, Stein was exploring an area of explicit concern, narration, and particularly narration configured somewhat along painterly lines, with a significant proviso that it must be temporally charged. For Stein, the problem for narration was that of creating a whole thing. Being what was assembled from its parts was a whole thing. Beside this, there is the important thing and the very American thing that everybody knows who is an American, just how many seconds, minutes, or hours it is going to take to do a whole thing. It is singularly, I don't believe this myself, it is singularly a sense for combination without a conception of the existence of a given space of time that makes the American thing, and the sense of this space of time must be within the whole thing. Time is a problem, American or not, given to narration, since it is in the nature of narration to give an account of change, even if, as in Stein's novel Lucy Church Amiably, the changing occurs along courses of circulation or within microsystems of distribution. Lucy Church Amiably has the narrative and also the theological structure of a tableau vivant. Vitality is the good temporality of life, just as life is the good inherent to time. That is Stein's theological proposition, and it is offered not only out of a euphoric joie de vivre, but also out of a dysphoric experience of temporal anxiety that had and has become an inherent feature of everyday life in its condition of lateness. Hypotheses regarding the nature of time, or even verification of its reality, as distinct from its reality effects, are presumably matters for physicists to take up. To consider the reality effects of time, on the other hand, how people feel its plenitude or dearth, its capaciousness or confining insistences, the pleasures or pressures it brings, the size and pace of its increments, our ability or inability to fit into it, etc. The consideration of such experiencings of time is a problem less for physics than for various branches of metaphysics and for history and art. It is also a topic for philosophy in its classical phase, or as it occasionally bears on art, as deliberative examination of the character of the good life. Time has also been a matter that economists and socioeconomists socioeconomic engineers have addressed, though apart perhaps from Marxist or Marxian economists. Economists often seem more interested in theorizing the means for getting the maximal profit rather than the maximal good out of time. The good of the good life is of several, sometimes incompatible sorts. On the one hand, the good of happiness, consciousness of pleasure, a sense of well-being, consciousness of love, and on the other hand, the good of fulfilled obligations, work, dutifulness, accomplishment, productivity, good citizenship. The latter are predicates of the good person, the former those of the good life. They coexist but are often incompatible. I would speculate that over the past 2 or more centuries, with the spread of what one might somewhat glibly call capitalocracy, despite propaganda from the commodity world to the contrary, emphasis has shifted from admiration and idealization of the good life to pressures on the individual to conform to a model of the good person, with goodness here appropriated to norms of dutifulness and productivity rather than to the eccentricities of delight, with consumption, though we are told that it contributes to individuation and delight, contributing to the networks that bind us to dutifulness. In the first paragraph of the opening dedicatory passage of Minima Moralia, Adorno says, "What the philosophers once knew as life has become the sphere of private existence, and now of mere consumption, dragged along as an appendage of the process of material production, without autonomy or substance of its own." I would agree, except that the principal things referred to in this sentence, the sphere of existence, consumption, material production, no longer exist as they did in 1945 when Adorno wrote that paragraph. Consumption, productivity, and private life are, in our contemporary technoculture, virtual as well as real, and as abstract as the time they take up in absorbing one another. The temporal anxieties that afflict modernity and then post-modernity reflect somewhat different experiences of time. For Gertrude Stein, it is modernity, not post-modernity, that is the relevant temporality. But there are features in her work that, in being elements proper to lateness, foreshadow postmodernism, which contains lateness, perhaps even as its defining trait, in both its catastrophic and its resistant forms. Modernity, of course, is the offshoot as well as context of industrial capitalism and of the commodity culture that it provides. The translation or transmutation of labor and time into product as commodity, as the site of what Marx famously termed time-congealed labor, obfuscated, mystified, fetishized, and in some sense allegorized as a value-bearing fragment of an exhausted life in its indecipherable past. This process went on at a relentlessly steady pace, and for a significant segment of the laboring population, although not for a member of the established middle class like Gertrude Stein, everyday life was a matter of endurance, even suffering. It was not, however, generally fraught with panic or frenzy. The capitalist owner-manager might hound the workers, but the worker was not, so to speak, self-hounding. The figure of the exemplarily self-motivated worker, the so-called self-starter, the self-administering, self-marshaling, adrenaline-fueled competitive worker, the overachieving contributor, belongs rather to postmodernity, in which what had been a middle-class work ethic spread into all strata of the general workforce. I have to digress for a minute. I have a really great nephew who has a really great high-pressure job as the marketing manager for an international global company that buys other high-tech companies and then markets whatever they do. And my nephew was just back, he's based in Europe, and he was just back, and there was a family dinner party, and another member of the family asked him what nations were hardest to deal with, and he said, France and Italy. They think it's a long work week if they work 55 hours a week. Can you believe it, he says? And I thought, oh no. All right, where was I? The middle class work ethic has spread into all strata of the general workforce. In the transition, the senses of urgency that had formerly been imposed on the worker are now composed by him or her. That sense of urgency, as long as it was imposed, remained unprocessed in the current vernacular sense, where to process means to internalize. But with a shift in the nature of work from production to service, and from mechanical to technological modes, and with a shift in class identification that seems to be commensurable with postmodernity's technological and surface orientation, it is precisely process rather than product that is the focus of work. Or rather, process is product. Such, in any case, is one account, cursory and oversimplified, but not altogether wrong. Under a regimen of maximal processing, maximal internalizing, we become our own owner. The other who drives us is ourself, the self with no time. A determining feature peculiar to modernism's particular temporality coalesced within modernity at a very specific moment, namely 12 noon on Sunday, November 18, 1883, when the standardization of time, brought about largely by relentless pressure from railroad and manufacturing interests, went into effect. There was resistance. Local populations in the U.S., for a variety of reasons, felt affronted that their time was to be superseded by someone else's, and that the hour was to be based on that of the Greenwich British meridian, tended to add to the effrontery. Boston, for example, was horrified to think that it would share noon with cities in the Deep South. Reform-minded people were concerned, too, at the corporate takeover of time. A certain William B. White, a Congregationalist church pastor in Boston, for example, rose up and denounced standard time as an immoral fraud, a lie and a piece of monopolistic work adverse to the working man's interest. Right on. Western Union, too, was slow to come around, as a significant part of its business involved the selling of time. Beginning in 1877, Western Union had dropped a time ball, the same kind of ball that falls in New York in Times Square on New Year's Eve. Beginning in 1877, Western Union had dropped a time ball every day at noon, local New York time as determined by astronomical observation. In addition to allowing immediate observers to regulate their watches and clocks, the dropping of the ball also telegraphed a signal to paying subscribers in the Northeast, including the principal watchmakers of the city of New York. The commercial interests won the day, and at 12 o'clock noon on Sunday, November 18, 1883, the so-called day of two noons, because clocks as they hit noon were then stopped and set back and went back to noon again in many places, the standard went into effect. People in cities gathered at jewelry stores and near public clocks to see what would happen. That quote is from Michael O'Malley. According to the account given in Michael O'Malley's Keeping Watch, A History of American Time, crowds of several hundred began forming in front of New York's Western Union building as early as 11:30 a.m. to await the time ball's drop. In Boston, a similar crowd of about 200 waited with a sort of scared look on their upturned faces. End quote. The standardization of time, along with the invention of the telephone. Did you know the world is coming to an end on May 21, by the way? Has anyone heard that? I think it's a California thing. It's not the first time it's come to an end in California. I just heard it 2 days ago and was surprised. So I'm giving a dinner party that night, so I'm thinking maybe I won't shop in advance. The standardization of time, along with the invention of the telephone and the spread of electric lighting, produced in the decades after 1880 a generally heightened sense of punctuality and urgency about time and clocks, a new and widespread formality in the experience of time in everyday work and life. Among other things, an ability or lack thereof to cope with time became a class marker. Highbrow theatrical and musical performances started punctually. Lowbrow entertainments kept a more casual relation to clock time. Unpunctuality, a Boston newspaper claimed in 1884, shows a relaxed morality in the musical community. Indifference to time stigmatized the latecomer as a moral leper and a social inferior. As a hardcore frequenter of poetry readings, which always begin late. I'm amused by that bit about our being moral lepers and social inferiors. The temporality in which modernism found itself was that of standardized, administered, and with the advent of World War I, ultimately militarized time. Postmodern temporality, on the other hand, the time we have, the time, let's say, of late and global capitalism, on the other hand, is experienced not as administered, but as atomized, as unadministratable, uncontrollable, indeed out of control, a temporality that is everywhere and nowhere. With the advent of time-free or time-independent, free time, but also time-consuming technological instruments or toys, we have all of time at our fingertips and no time for anything. Email, cell phones, tweets, text messages, Facebook maintenance, listservs, wikis, these are all also placeless. And in them, one finds oneself and others rendered simultaneously unplaced and replaced. Unplaced because it doesn't matter where you are as long as you have your technological device at hand, and replaced because this technology moves you, replaces you virtually. Technology shares this power with ideology. We are shadowed ominously by the possibility that we could be replaced in another sense too, that our presence in the system is arbitrary, impersonal, that we are signs rather than signifieds, signs rather than significant. The high drama of Gertrude Stein's struggle against insignificance and administered identity was only in its incipient stages in 1927 when she wrote Lucy Church amiably, much of it in a state of pleasure, albeit it is an increasingly cloudy pleasure, over the beauties of the countryside in southwestern France, where she and Alice B. Toklas, after considerable machinations, had secured the summer house of our dreams. When they first spotted it, it was occupied by a French naval lieutenant who was stationed in the area with his family. The lieutenant had no intention of giving up the house, but either serendipitously or more probably as a result of months of behind-the-scenes machinations by Stein, Toklas, and some of their influential friends, the lieutenant was precipitously transferred to Africa. Stein's success in acquiring the house surfaces in the novel Lucy Church amiably. Lucy Church rented a valuable house for what it was worth. She was prepared to indulge herself in this pleasure and did so. She was not able to take possession at once, as it was at the time occupied by a lieutenant in the French Navy. There inevitably was and would be delay in the enjoyment of the very pleasant situation which occupying the house so well adapted to the pleasures of agreeableness and delicacy would undoubtedly continue, and so it was. In this passage, Stein casts herself as Lucy Church, driven not so much by the pressure of the autobiographical truth, but because Stein's purchasing power provides her with a landscape. And in this sense, it has the compositional force that Lucy Church in the novel, and more importantly, her original, the eponymous church in the small town of Lucy, likewise commands. Both are able to command the field. Both establish a prospect of stability, a gravitational field, by incarnating the virtue of mobility, the movable center that allows us to imagine time and experience a present moment in it. Composition is a critical phenomenological possibility for Stein. It harbors the pragmatic truth of space and time in their application to human experience and to the work of art insofar as it attests to that experience. She addresses the topic in Composition as Explanation, her enormously successful first public lecture, which she delivered in England, once at Oxford and once at Cambridge, the summer before she began Lucy Church amiably. The lecture builds on a realization she had come to after prolonged visual engagement with modernist realism. As she said in a 1946 interview, "Everything I have done has been influenced by Flaubert and Cézanne, and this gave me a new feeling about composition. Up to that time, composition had consisted of a central idea, to which everything else was an accompaniment and separate, but was not an end in itself. And Cézanne conceived the idea that in composition, one thing was as important as another thing. Each part is as important as the whole, and that impressed me enormously." This insight, meanwhile, had emerged from another, which Stein had come to in the process of writing her 1,000-page novelistic study, The Making of Americans. The gist of this discovery is that it is through one's everyday habits that one makes oneself, which is also to say that the business of life, the process of living, and the being of individuality, the bottom nature of the individual, are inextricable. In Composition as Explanation, Stein attempts to summarize this pair of insights, that each thing in a composition is of equal importance, and that particulars make themselves what they are over time, which is to say by being what they are again and again. Quote, beginning again and again, explaining composition and time is a natural thing. Composition is the thing seen by everyone living in the living they are doing. They are that composing of the composition that at the time they are living is the composition of the time in which they are living. It is that makes living a thing they are doing. The time when and the time of and the time in that composition is the natural phenomena of that composition, and of that perhaps everyone can be certain. Stein wrote Composition as Explanation in 1926. During the following year, unnerved by her brief moment in the limelight of celebrity in England, she continued to explore, first in Four Saints in Three Acts, her opera, and then in Lucy Church Amiably, the certainties that the pronouncements of composition as explanation claimed to establish. And she found herself returning to it a near decade later, in 1935, in the aftermath of her visit to America as a public figure, a famous personage. She spent about like a week or 10 days in Chicago and gave a couple of lectures here, and then spent a day riding around with a policeman in a patrol car, which was the high point of her visit to America. That and flying in an airplane and realizing that the landscape is flat. In becoming suddenly well known, she had acquired an audience, and this had imposed on her what she termed identity, and the effects were devastating. She felt she had lost her mind, or to be precise, her human mind. Tears come into my eyes when I say the human mind, she writes in the Geographical History of America, which came like 5 years later. To understand a thing means to be in contact with that thing, and the human mind can be in contact with anything. Any minute, then, is anything if there is a human mind. In the aftermath of her visit to America, her venture into the media-saturated climate that has created postmodernity, Stein felt she had acquired, or been afflicted with, identity and lost her compositional power. Think of how very often there is not a human mind, and so any minute is not anything. The Geographical History of America is at many points a heartbroken work, in which the general happiness, the temporal success of Lucy Church Amiably, only occasionally disturbed by ripples of anxiety, has been overthrown. Stein had been administered an identity, itself a product of administered time, what in the Geographical History she calls history. Now identity remembers, and so it has an audience, and as it has an audience, it is history, and as it is history, it has nothing to do with the human mind. Identity is history, and history is not true, because history is dependent upon an audience. Perhaps time is nothing more than a term for a feeling about the quality and quantity of one's life and of the period in which one is living it. Or rather, it is the medium for feeling, as light is the medium for seeing. It is mere ambience, with the ubiquity and yet perturbability of the everyday and its small, crucial increments of difference. Everyday life is comprised of the sub-historical details of numerous strata of experienced and unexperienced life. But it is everywhere a product of history-shaping forces, class dynamics, technologies, received and inherited ideas, established practices, derived expectations, established roles, etc. The forms of everyday life and the practices that are undertaken as an expression of those forms, even when the practices deform them, are suffused with history. It is perseveringly quotidian, banal, filled with insignificance. It is the microcosm of biological maintenance. And that, of course, is utterly binding on us. The microcosmic business of staying alive constitutes the macrocosmic realm of the habitual that allows for viable habitation, sheer survival. Ever the same, repetitive, rippling with recurrence, the everyday is nonetheless the realm most susceptible to chance, contingency, the random, the unforeseen. It is the realm of the absurd but necessary, the meaningless and arbitrary, the given, to which one commits oneself or is bound in full knowledge of its meaninglessness, its absurdity, its triviality, and in fundamental need of what it provides. It is the sphere of commonality, of shared necessities, shared conditions, to which we attend dutifully, obedient to its exigencies. And yet it is the realm in which we individually exercise idiosyncrasy, establish our distinctiveness. It is the realm in which we carry out a rich and autonomous private life, a secret realm, the province of free time and the personal. It is the world of our individuality. Everyday life is a realm of decisions, choices, and thus, in some sense, it is an ethical sphere. It is the realm of living with one's choices, or of enduring conditions and circumstances over which one has minimal or no control. It is the realm of the inescapable and yet forgettable. And yet again, it is a realm binding us to memory, where the particulars of our way of being who we are situated. It is the realm of accumulation and proliferation. To quote Stein, this leading to that as conferring plentifully what each one did. But everyday life is also the realm of decomposition and degeneration, the province of everything's aging, a realization that brings to mind a comment that Edward Said makes about modernism. Modernism has come to seem paradoxically not so much a movement of the new as a movement of aging and ending. Any set of predicates then, or list of qualities or characteristics attributable to or descriptive of everyday life will turn up binarisms and contradictions. It is a terrain of incommensurabilities, of seemingly unassimilated unassimilables or invisibilized visibles. It is the realm of multiple discourses and of what, borrowing Jean-Francois Lyotard's term, we might call their differends. But they generate, too, what I will term allegorical features of the nexus of everyday life, features, albeit not the only ones, that mark modernist works of everyday life as late, or as the precursors of postmodernism, which is the lateness of modernism. T.J. Clark offers an explicitly situationist description of modernism in The Painting of Modern Life, where he characterizes it as a response to the shift within production towards the provision of consumer goods and services and the accompanying colonization of everyday life, end quote. This shift and the colonized condition of everyday life that it produces is what I am attributing to postmodernism as the temporal effects of this shift take hold and people become aware that their everyday life is fully occupied as well as preoccupied. It is important to keep in mind the negative as well as the positive features of a nexus. The threads and the web they produce are crucial, but so too are the holes, as well as the contextual peripheries. The nexus produces what Tolstoy insistently termed a labyrinth of linkages, and as is the case in all labyrinths, it includes dead ends, false halts. And there are between the labyrinthine lines linking things, gaps, holes, open spaces. It is these that help mitigate against the totalizing force within the everyday of naturalized ideology, of history. History, as Said put it, as a grand system to which everyone and every smaller narrative is subject, and particularly subject to forgetting. Within what Adorno and then Said term late style, we can locate something of art's response to the forces bearing on temporal experience and notions of the good life. Late style is a term that Said, in his posthumously published On Late Style, takes from Adorno's provocative and concise essay of 1937 titled Late Style in Beethoven. The lateness to which Adorno refers is concomitant with biographical or biological lateness in the life of a given artist, discernible in works produced toward the end of his or her life. This style might reflect the artist's ultimate vision of greater harmonies than the turbulence of youth and history reveal, a new spirit of reconciliation and serenity, as Said puts it. Shakespeare's Winter's Tale or The Tempest are obvious examples, and these are the ones that Said gives. But Said goes on to ask, what of artistic lateness not as harmony and resolution, but as intransigence, difficulty, and unresolved contradiction? This is late style as Adorno describes it. As he puts it in the opening of the essay, the maturity of the late works of significant artists does not resemble the kind one finds in fruit. They are, for the most part, not round but furrowed, even ravaged, devoid of sweetness, bitter and spiny. They do not surrender themselves to mere delectation. They lack all the harmony that the classicist aesthetic is in the habit of demanding from works of art, and they show more traces of history than of growth. And he concludes the essay with a famous comment in the history of art, late works are the catastrophes. For Said, late style is not only the style of significant artists near the end of their life, but of significant art in the context of lateness generally, whether we call it late capitalism or the late days of Earth. Lateness as it is now and has been for a century or more. As Said has said, literary modernism itself can be seen as a late style phenomenon. Said explores an array of late style works in his book, but like Adorno, he generally refuses to list the elements that might be said to be peculiar to it. What they effect, however, is fairly clear. Resistance in the form of discord, a refusal or failure to effect internal harmony. Resistance in the form of untimeliness, anachronicity. Resistance in the form of incongruity, being out of place, a refusal or failure to fit into or achieve harmony with external conditions. In writing The Making of Americans, Gertrude Stein had been interested in typologies of human character. By 1927, a quarter of a century later, she was thinking about periodicity, about centuries. It was a topic she continued to explore. Thus in Picasso, her little monograph on the painter, which she wrote near the end of the landscape period, she characterizes the 20th century in terms that are much like those that Adorno attributes to lateness. The 20th century has much less reasonable in its existence than the 19th century, but reasonableness does not make for splendor. The 17th century had less reason in its existence than the 16th century, and in consequence, it has more splendor. So the 20th century is that. It is a time when everything cracks, where everything is destroyed, everything isolates itself. It is a more splendid thing than a period where everything follows itself. The splendor of which Stein speaks is instantiated in modernism's great works of art. For Stein, I think, they exist as a counter to the forces of identity, whose damaging effects Stein had had a glimpse of during her visit to England in 1926 and would be devastated by in the wake of her visit to America. In Picasso, she gives an account of a crisis that the great painter himself was undergoing at the time she was writing Lucy Church Amiably. An account that I suspect is as much autobiographical, her own, as biographical. For the first time in his life, 6 months passed without his working, she says. It was the very first time in his life. He having a sensitiveness and a tenderness and a weakness that makes him wish to share the things seen by everybody. He always in his life is tempted, as a saint can be tempted, to see things as he does not see them. During these 6 months, the only thing he did was a picture made of a rag cut by a string. During the great moment of Cubism, he made such things. At that time, it gave him great joy to do it, but now it was a tragedy, end quote. The struggle against identity, against seeing things falsely, as well as being seen falsely, and the tragic sense that accompanies it is fundamental to lateness. In Lucy Church Amiably, Stein stages it phenomenologically as an intrinsic element in the plotting of the everyday landscape that the novel is and is about. The elements of lateness that I can point out begin syntactically in a proliferation of verbal infinitives and lexical repetitions. Stein no longer uses the participial constructions that were such a marked and substantive feature of her earlier writings, as for example in Orta or One Dancing. She was dancing, she was asking anyone who had been one, expressing that meaning as existing to be one, assisting, dancing to be existing. She was dancing, anyone was then assisting that dancing be existing, and so on. In Lucy Church Amiably, the participial tense, the continuous present, and indeed continuousness itself are no longer accurate to experience. Instead, we have infinitives and the strangely dark nuances that they cast. To understand, they undertake to overthrow their undertaking. This stand, and to understand, to undertake, to overthrow their undertaking. Lucy Church Amiably is a book of grassy, fine distinctions, of Jamesian distinctions, the James in question being, in this case, Henry, not William. Thus, in the corner there is an addition to destruction, and so strangers will not be pleased, and he and she have said that they will not do what they have not said they will do. And he, the son who is taller, will not be especially anxious to be invited, but as he was not to go. He did not mean to be left lately. Repetition is a prominent occurrence in all of Stein's work. It is not peculiar to Lucy Church Amiably. Indeed, for those more frequent in her day than ours, who bother to parody Stein, it is a readily available source of fun, disdainful though the fun may be. But repetition is not repetition in Stein. As she famously said more than once, there is no repetition. Each thing that happens more than one happens at a different time and therefore differently. This reiterative differing is constitutive of the thing and of its visibility. Presence is temporal. It takes place not in isolation, but in reiteration, by beginning again and again. For Stein, what I am here terming presence is of utmost importance. A major function of a work of art is to sustain the vitality of the present, to sustain life in and as presence. The alternative is effective morbidity. But it is in the character of that presence, in its figurative peculiarity, that lateness as a resistant negativity, not unlike the one we find in Adorno's dialectic, make a stand. Adorno sees his resistance figured in terms not of identity, but as non-identity, resistant to being subsumed and administered in either an epistemological economy or a system of fungibility. Non-identity emerges from what Barbara Maria Stafford calls the old opposition between Parmenides' assertion that being was identity and Heraclitus' declaration that being was difference. Non-identity is the means, the mediating presence, though it makes itself present by making or finding a gap, through which an individual in society or the aesthetic presence in a work of art, or let me dare to suggest the good in life, evades domination. Non-identity is the shifty logic that undoes totalization and screws up coherence. It has no place other than utopia, which is no place at all, or lateness, of the sort that I believe Stein, foreseeing the disaster of identity, plotted out in Lucy Church Amiably, and populated with the kinds of grammatical and lexical reiterations I've referred to, and with figures, characters, if you will, that are similarly reiterative. One such is Lucy Church, or the Lucy Churches, whose various iterations include the church in the town of Lucy, with a cupola-top steeple that provides Lucy Church with the occasional pseudonym of Lucy Pagoda. The incoherence of these iterations, their failure to consolidate into a single identity, spreads across the text. Even gender resists coherence. The names that move through the text include a frequently cited Simon Therese, a Sarah Frederick, and various Marys, James Mary and John Mary, and a Mary who marries a Mary and becomes Mary Mary, and William Mary. Probably the most famous instance of Stein's use of repetition against redundancy and for the sake of particularization occurs in one of her best-known sentences, "A rose is a rose is a rose." During her travels in America, asked to explain the line, Stein said, we all know that it's hard to write poetry in a late age. And we know that you have to put some strangeness, something unexpected, into the structure of the sentence in order to bring back a vitality to the noun. Now listen, I'm no fool. I know that in daily life we don't go around saying is. Yes, I'm no fool, but I think that in that line the rose is read for the first time in English poetry for 100 years. end quote. The effect of Stein's non-identical, non-identifying beginning again and again is not just that it makes lateness manifest in the nexus of modernity, but that it proffers lateness as that nexus, as its internal condition, a salutary incoherence. To begin again and again is to stand repeatedly clear of the force of administered history. There must be no remembering, as Stein put it. Remembering is repetition. Remembering is also confusion. Anything one is remembering is a repetition, but existing as a human being is never repetition. It is not repetition if it is that which you are actually doing, because naturally each time the emphasis is different, just as the cinema from one frame to the next has each time a slightly different thing to make it all be moving. And each one of us has to do that, otherwise there is no existing. The topos of beginning again and again bears affinities with features that Walter Benjamin ascribes to allegory. To allegorize is to speak of one thing in terms of another. That's what the term means etymologically in the original Greek, and that's generally what it means in practice. But in the allegorical figures that are of interest to Walter Benjamin, the other of which the allegory speaks is what the figures have lost from themselves. The figures exist as emblems of what capital H history obliterates, which is little h history, the experience of being in time, with the possibility of the knowledge, the sheer memorability of what has been. As Benjamin says in The Origin of German Tragic Drama, allegories are in the realm of thoughts what ruins are in the realm of things. They embody lateness as the loss of time. But the allegorical also has constellating, or in Stein's terms, compositional force. For Benjamin, allegory is the structuring principle of history, the gathering of historical figures. For Stein, beginning again and again mobilizes particularity, rescuing things from the totalizing power of generality and time from the obliterating force of history. Beginning again and again makes time. Temporal experience was something that Gertrude Stein had given much thought to ever since she liberated literary realism from its narrative condition and embarked on the radical experiment of mind and matter that became her early masterpiece, Tender Buttons. The allegorical element that inhabits Lucy Church amiably is not a tragic one, though it does harbor something of the pathos that is inherent to the temporal dispersal that is characteristic of lateness. But there is a gravitational force that Stein's allegorical figuration exerts as it undertakes its imaginative work. The landscape that Stein, as she put it, tried to write down in Lucy Church amiably was a landscape that made itself its own landscape. As such, it exists in a rich and resonant temporal present, a site for lively life, which is to say, for Stein, a good life, even a saintly one. This present temporality is not the specious eternal present of omnitemporality, expressed grammatically in sentences like cows eat grass, a timeless truism that has no true temporal reference point at all. It is rather a constellated present, replete with temporal reference points. It is the role of artistic composition, imagination, to make present, as the present, the experience of two noons. The bells of the Lucy Church toll the hours, 2:30, 3:30, 4:30, 5:30, 6:30, 7:30, 8:30. It is the pleasure of the very different difference every afternoon. Thanks. So I think there's supposed to be.
Sorry, I just.
That's okay. I sort of tilted more and more this way to catch the light. Let me put on my glasses so I can see people. Does anybody want to comment? Or there's a lot in there. I never know when I go to talks what to say until afterwards. But anybody has a question or comment or? Yes. Go ahead.
Could you say more about Stein's relationship to modern art and to Cézanne in particular, maybe?
Yeah, just briefly. Her brother, Leo Stein, and began a huge art collection And they came to own, Stein's best friend was Picasso, and she and her brother Leo ended up owning a vast number of Cézanne's, Picasso's. Matisse was another friend, and so they had like hundreds of paintings. And one of her earlier, just before she wrote Tender Buttons, she wrote a trilogy, 3 stories called 3 Lives. And she and her brother had bought a Cézanne portrait of Madame Cézanne, and Stein claimed that she wrote it sitting under that painting. If you go to your Chicago Art Institute, there's a Cézanne painting called Basket of Apples. And if you look at that, you can see that what she says about what she learned from Cézanne, that every single point in that painting is equally important, and there is no real vanishing point. And that's sort of that was like the first lesson she learned from the painters. And then she and Picasso had endless discussions in the period as he was developing Cubism. So then she got into sort of the analytics of composition, for which she exercised in a series of portraits, including the works that appear in Tender Buttons. And she continued to be interested in painters. For the moment, the history of the history of painting would suggest that her taste declined, or her ability to discern great painting became less accurate to the times. So she had some big enthusiasms that nobody cares about anymore. But early on, she was impeccable in her choices. And who knows, Sir Francis Rose may return. Yeah, you had a question or a comment?
I was just thinking, one of my favorite statements of Steins is that the detective novel is the only truly modern novel that's come into existence because the event is over and the hero is dead before the novel begins.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you thought maybe that had something to do with this idea of lateness.
Oh, lateness. Well, the other thing I think is true about Stein's interest in detective novels is, quite apart from the construction of the novel itself, that detection is an entirely paratactic undertaking, that the detective goes into a room and looks at every single detail in the room. They're all, as far as the detective knows, equal salience. So a scuff mark on the chair leg may be as important as the invaluable diamond that's sitting on the mantelpiece. In terms of lateness, I can't really. The Ernest Mandel, the author of Late Capitalism, that big thick tome from early 80s, I think, wrote another wonderful book analyzing detective novels, and confessing that he was an avid reader of them. And his argument, which is about the relation of the detective novel in its history to capitalism, insofar as I have made a connection, maybe too much even an equation, and I think that's to be queried, between lateness and late capitalism, or late style and late capitalism, or the conditions of contemporary life which are expressed in late style and subject to late capitalism. There might be something in the detective novel that one could unravel in terms of thinking about lateness.
I was just thinking about the idea of, of the story already being over before it starts.
Right. Although, I think, ultimately, Stein's version of history and Said's, in the quotes that I give, are accurate to those works, but I think it behooves us to keep our mind on the pressures of history on everything that's unfolding. But yeah, that's a good question. I have to think about it and exploit it. Yeah, John?
This isn't really a question, it's more a comment. As you were talking about the everyday and about habit, and also talking about late start, you helped me for the first time to really feel I understand the late paintings of Philip Guston, which it seems to me might be a response to the development of the signature Guston, which becomes a commodity, but instead is replaced by a construction of a self out of simply habits and the detritus of the everyday, reconstructing the self, and which also often have blank clock faces attached to them. So it's a kind of destruction of the idea of meaningful time and directed time, and instead figures just composed out of the most residual gestures, almost an arm somewhere off one part
Right.
of the canvas, a cigarette somewhere, and absolutely down to that kind of basic, but that basic then becomes tremendously affirmative in late style.
That's brilliant. I think that's right. They're such great paintings. Anyone else? Yes.
Something like modernism seems much a movement of
Aging and
aging and ending. And I wonder, because older people tell me a lot that time keeps going by fast and fast as you get older and older. And
Yes.
I didn't experience it in my short life. And I wonder if, when looking at history, I guess especially the last century's worth of history, when people say time keeps going by faster and faster, how much of that is because of the big age historical forces of the technology and all the other changes, and how much is the little age historical forces just of its human nature? And when people see their 80th Christmas, it seems like it's come faster because the time since last year has been 1/80th of their lifetime rather than when they were 5.
That's my explanation. It's just, today is like such a smaller percent of my life than my 9-year-old granddaughter's day today. But I do think that the pressures on us temporally are excruciating, and in relation to pressures on time in the past. And I mean, my anecdote about my nephew, like just incredulous that people in those southern countries, those Mediterranean countries, would think that working a 50-hour work week was nothing and beneath notice. Says something awful, really, I think, not about my nephew, but about for capitalism to work as for there to be capital, there has to be excess to invest. And so you have to get more money for each chunk of money, and you have to get more productivity out of people. And I mean, there's a young scholar theorist named Sian Nye, who some of you might know her book Ugly Feeling, but she's got a project that she's working on currently about zaniness. And it's basically a shift that plays out mostly in TV and cinema. Those are her examples. But I could think of some other examples more in kids' novels, like the current really bloody, big fat novels for children, the preteen and teen set. The Hunger Games some of you might have read that. Everyone's read it in California because the world's going to be doing it on May 21st. Anyway, this huge pressure on time, I think, is really like endlessly coming at us. And I can't remember where I was going to go on that. Has anyone read The Hunger Games? Oh, this is really interesting. It's marketed. It's a trilogy, but the first one is called The Hunger Games. It's marketed for like 14 to 16-year-olds, but it's like 9 to 13-year-olds that are reading it, and then adults. And the basic premise is it's a post-apocalyptic US, and the US is divided into 12 districts. The totalitarian government is headquartered in Denver, and the 12th district, which is where our heroine comes from, is in Appalachia. And every district has to annually donate 2 children, and the ages 9 to 12, I think, or maybe 9 to 13, to fight to the death. So there's 24 children every year that go, and all of it is televised live. It's Survivor. It's an attack on reality television. And everyone in the society in the US is compelled to watch it, under penalty of death if you don't watch it. So you have to watch this gruesome thing. So there's 3 volumes of this, and they're about 600 pages long. And they do it. And it's really just amazing. And there's like some analyses of why children are reading these books. And one currently dominant theory is that the lives of children are dysphoric, that the teenage child has no control over their lives, driven to school, can't escape, bullied, criticized, made to do endless amounts of work, blah, blah, blah. And I tested this with 4 young children in my family, ages 9 to 12, and they said, oh, no, that's not it at all. They're good. I don't know. But it's this there is like this dysphoric sense, I think, that, or a dysphoric experience that is related to some kind of temporal pressure. Any other? Yes?
I want to ask you a question about poetry, and I was thinking about poetry when you were making that sort of index of all the things that the everyday is. And I was thinking, is the everyday the problem of poetry now? And at the same time, is poetry a way, is it one of those resistances by incoherence of administered time? And then does the everyday have something to do with that? Is that the province also of that resistance?
Well, I have 2 things to say. One is I will pick up the lovely euphemism by means of which Adorno avoids referring to evaluating art by saying significant works of art rather than great works of art or masterpieces, etc. And tentatively say that many contemporary significant works of poetry do seem to be situating themselves within terrains of incoherence, precisely to be resistant to the sort of administered orders of logic and comprehensibility and reason. But that's certainly not new to poetry now. I mean, that's not new to now. The other thing, and I don't say this as a way to escape your question, because I think it's a really good question, is I've become, just as a teacher, decreasingly interested in setting up my syllabi around great or significant works, and looking rather at historically at what gets written at a given time and what gets read and who reads it and why. And my initial inspiration for this is Carrie Nelson's enormously great book called Repression and Recovery. It's the politics of cultural, it's about, anyway, it's a book without chapters in which he talks about as much of what was published between 1910 and 1940 in the United States as he could unearth. And it's really fascinating. just the world, that like way more people were reading Edna St. Vincent Millay, or, well, who I actually think is a significant poet. But I can't think of Amy Lowell, but also people we've never heard of. I mean, we don't remember anymore, that were hugely popular. Edgar Lee Masters. Anyway, as well as like trade, labor union magazines. And so I think cowboy poetry, that might be declining now, but 10 years ago, there would be these roundups in the old, the Cowboy West, Montana, and where 40,000 people would come and listen to cowboy poetry and love it. And why not? So I don't know if it's significant, but it's totally fine. So and that is based on the very opposite. Like one could have an argument that just thinking of all the uses of poetry or all the uses of art that could be named historically. Comfort, insight, elevation, truth, pleasure, amusement, anecdote. The highwayman came riding up to that whatever it was, Longfellow. I mean, so I don't know, but I think that, and I think that maybe currently a lot of significant poetry is taking a stance which is not only implicitly critical, but explicitly critical. Not as preachiness, but actually looking at materials that are available on the web, for example, and using that kind of diction, or even those kinds of facts. An example that's easily available is Juliana Spar's This Connection of Everybody with Lungs, which was written in the aftermath of 9/11. And in it, there are sections that just name weaponry. And it's almost like an incantation. It's incredibly, scarily seductive. And she's doing it. She's naming these weapons and weapon systems seductively, precisely to suggest that we're seduced by them. So there's lots of different ways, rather than using disjunct syntax or any other. Yeah, Judith? As a practitioner of significant art in our time?
I just wanted to say in relation to what Professor Elman was saying, it seems like rather than talking about Stein's lateness as a mode of belatedness or afterwardsness, what you're saying is that lateness means late time, i.e. administered time or time connected to this kind of vicious punctuality that administered time is made into, and that Stein is kind of like turning that punctuality against itself by beginning again and again and allowing for a kind of non-administered vivacity to come through. So it's because I was trying to think about, okay, lateness and beginning again and again, like I was trying to figure out how those two things work together, but once I realized that you didn't mean, or I think you didn't mean by lateness afterwardsness, that's sort of...
Yeah, no, it's an in-time condition. It's not after time is over. That's the point. And it's precisely because Stein was aware, like, and even when I've taught Stein, I've said, look, Stein did this to do this, which is art for art's sake, right? And it helps undergraduates especially understand, take the first step into something like Tender Buttons, or Jackson Pollock, because that's more familiar to them. He did this because there it is. It's a didness, and it's fantastic. And but in fact, she's really struggling with something in addition to that. It's a way of being in time that really matters. So the work of art is not transcendent out of time, but is, in its lateness, is entirely temporal. Yes?
I have a question that's totally related to that. There's, it's trying to keep track of all of the relations between kind of contradiction and saturation that you were looking for, the sort of modernism and late modernism or modernism and contemporary or something. And I thought, and this might be in contrast to what you were saying, I sort of thought the point about beginning again at the end was that you could never not be aspiring to the present. And that whereas in the present, people are saturated by the present. And the problem is trying to find a space that you can't experience unresolved. I've been thinking a lot about how alienation doesn't feel alienated anymore, but it's the opposite. Like alienation now feels like the saturation.
The new normal.
and that so like whereas in modernity, in historically situated modernity, the thing that you're describing as lateness is the aspiration to the present that you never quite fulfill. So you can always experience its contradiction. You can always experience identity as a kind of deadness rather than the aspiration to identity as a kind of liveness. Whereas the thing that you're describing now is that you can only try to like completely on a spark. I'm ready about it. I've been thinking a lot about this too. Trying to make a fold within the saturated space, but there's no outside to it. And you can't progress from it, and you can't. There's no space that you can aspire to. The problem would be getting out of it, or the problem would be going somewhere, or the problem would be moving it, or would be So I wondered if you could think you could talk more about the present, the problem of saturation in the present, that's a temporal one as opposed to a representational one.
Extension of the landscape issue, which it thrilled her, and sort of culminates in Four Saints in Three Acts, where saintliness is just being alive as the present, in the present, which is the landscape, which is always changing but always the same, never repeats, etc. The next step of that, which I'm hinting at, or maybe I'm naming in this talk, is the saturation problem, which may be the problem of, like I unabashedly raised global capitalism over and over, or right now, like the attacks on education that are going on globally in the developed world, which is now undeveloping, by setting it up so its citizenry will learn and know less and less progressively and under more and more difficult conditions. To fight that, you just don't know where to turn. And it's like that is the saturation problem, is the ubiquity and the inescapability of it. Everyday life looks like it might be, I'm just thinking off the top of my head here. Everyday life looks like it might be that same saturation, same site of saturation. And it is to some extent because everyday life is simply suffused with all the effects of late capitalism, like including temporality, maybe most importantly. But it's also a site in which idiosyncratically we evade that, or we can attempt to evade it. Which is to make a different kind of present, I guess, in terms of your terms.
That has to do with the difference between a break in your earlier model and an embedment, like you evaded by invading it or something.
Right. Yeah, well, like the holes in the web, which are not outside the web, they're still in the web. I haven't figured out how we're going to get out of the web, nor has anyone else that I can see. David Harvey, do people know his work? I just read his most recent book, The Enigma of Capital. And at the end, he begins to hold up, like not a carrot, but like a package of carrot seeds that he might be about to figure out how we can get out of this. But my attempts to organize at Berkeley have been like, there was like a very high moment, and it's just gone down and down and down. I think if people feel generally like there is no elsewhere to it, no rabbit hole, whatever. I'm sure there must be, but who knows? Yeah, Chiku.
Is lateness kind of tied to kind of, we've been talking about lateness in relation to kind of different kinds of catastrophe, and just the term late capital, evokes, the kind of catastrophic kind of narrative of history that we're on. I'm just wondering if lateness is necessarily in the kinds of writing that you're interested in, with the kind of like apocalypticism, or even the kind of children's books that you're talking about post-apocalyptic. And is there like a jollier version of being late? And the reason I ask that is because I'm thinking of a book of yours that it's not maybe a late book, but maybe it's a middle period book called The Beginner, that is all about beginning again and again. And when I read that book, I can't tell if the beginner is beginning again and again because she's terrified of what will come next, or if she's actually, euphoric.
I think she's neither in that book. What the position that I was trying to suggest was, I can't remember if it was, this is awful that I can't, if it was Kierkegaard or Nietzsche. I think it was Kierkegaard, yeah, that said he was, had never been anything but a beginner. That was what catalyzed that. And what he meant was, I think two things. One is he may have been alluding to what Plato, but more maybe clearly Aristotle said is the beginning of philosophy, which is wonder that anything exists at all, which is the beginning position, and sort of the opening, the space into which the first queries can happen. And so I was positing the notion of a beginner as someone who is in the querying position and doesn't leave it. It's kind of my old theme, one way or another, I fear. Yeah, so it's not euphoric, but it's not despairing either. And there's some degree of self-ironization of it in it playfully. Anything else for now? Thanks, all of you. Those were really excellent, inspiring questions. Thank you.